Often overshadowed by the Army's larger presence, the Royal Australian Navy played an active and crucial role in the Vietnam War from 1965 to 1972. The Navy provided medical aid, logistical support, and transported over 16,000 soldiers to the war zone. Furthermore, throughout the conflict, Navy destroyers fired nearly 100,000 rounds of ammunition and covered over 400,000 miles. Also, the clearing diving teams conducted thousands of ship searches for explosives. In total, 18 Royal Australian Navy ships were deployed during the war. This is their story. Welcome to Heart of Oak's first video about the Royal Australian Navy. Although Australia had been involved in the Vietnam conflict since 1962 by sending military advisors, the country officially joined the war as an active combatant in 1965. Alongside other Pacific nations like the US, New Zealand, the Philippines, and Thailand, Australia fought against North Vietnam. Australia's participation was officially justified by its commitment to the US-backed Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, also known as SEATO, which was established in 1954 in Manila to provide collective defense in the region. One of SEATO's main goals was to stop the spread of communism and protect its member states from foreign aggression. And since South Vietnam was a member state, the North Vietnamese attack provided SEATO members with a reason to intervene. However, not all SEATO members participated militarily. The UK, for example, refrained from military involvement. Unofficially, other factors also influenced Australia's decision to join the war. Prime Minister Robert Menzies aimed to strengthen Australia's alliance with the US, and there was significant anti-communist sentiment within the Australian government and public. Initially, Menzies committed just one battalion, but over time, the number of Australian troops increased, with a total of 60,000 Australian Navy, Army, and Air Force personnel serving throughout the war. Australia's involvement in Vietnam sparked social unrest at home, particularly due to the use of conscription, which forced many young men to fight. Anti-war protests grew, and some were even imprisoned for opposing the government's foreign policy. By the time Australia withdrew from combat operations in December 1972, after nearly 7 years of active fighting, over 500 Australians had lost their lives in Vietnam. The Royal Australian Navy's involvement in Vietnam began even before Australia officially intervened militarily in 1965. These early deployments were in line with Australia's policy at the time, supporting South Vietnam without engaging in active combat. In 1962, Her Majesty's Australian ships Vampire and Quickmatch were the first to visit the region, making a goodwill visit to Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The following year, the Q-class destroyers Quiberon and Queensborough followed. During these operations, crew members participated in various activities, including a visit to the Vietnamese Special Forces Training Center. However, in 1963, during one of these visits, the Vietnamese naval vessel Qui Hoa accidentally collided with and damaged Quiberon while attempting to dock alongside her. When Australia became an active combatant in 1965, one of the first roles of the Navy became the transportation of troops and equipment to the war zone. During the Vietnam War, the responsibility of transporting, supplying, and maintaining Australian forces in South Vietnam was shared among the Royal Australian Air Force, civilian aircraft, mainly from Qantas Airlines, Australian National Line ships, and the Royal Australian Navy, which carried out the bulk of the work. The former aircraft carrier HMAS Sydney became the primary vessel for transporting Australian troops and supplies to and from Vietnam. Sydney's first voyage to South Vietnam, escorted by HMAS Melbourne, Duchess, and Parramatta, began on May 27, 1965. For her crew, this initial trip helped establish the routines necessary for a logistics task that hadn't been undertaken by the Navy in over 20 years, so since the end of the Second World War. It also allowed the crew to get to know their new surroundings and identify potential risks faced in hostile waters. This trip was the start of Sydney's numerous supply runs between Australia and the South Vietnamese port of Vung Tau, which earned her the nickname the Vung Tau Ferry. Before each journey, soldiers would board the ship, guided by the Royal Australian Navy crew, who helped them acclimatize to the ship's unfamiliar environment, including how to sling hammocks for sleeping. While the journey itself was challenging due to cramped conditions and the intense tropical heat, soldiers appreciated the service, according to the Department of Veterans Affairs. The ship's crew remained on high alert during loading and unloading operations in Vung Tau, with armed sentries on deck and divers patrolling the waters for potential threats. Fortunately, neither Sydney nor her escort ships were ever attacked during these operations. For returning troops, the voyage back to Australia after a 12-month tour must have offered a welcome break. After months in uncomfortable conditions, they were finally able to relax on board with better food, hot showers, and some much-needed rest. Their long journey home also gave them time to reflect upon their days in Vietnam before returning to the freedom of Australian society. In total, HMAS Sydney completed 24 transport runs, carrying over 16,000 personnel and thousands of tons of equipment. Her final voyage in November 1972 delivered defense aid to Vietnam and Cambodia, marking the end of her service in the conflict. Sydney was not the only vessel which did supply runs. Her efforts were supported by auxiliary vessels such as motor vessel Booneroo and motor vessel Jeparit. Booneroo made only 2 voyages, but the Jeparit completed 43 trips between 1966 and 1972. Both ships initially faced challenges with anti-war sentiments and crew shortages due to Union opposition, but after being commissioned as Royal Australian Navy vessels, they continued their vital cargo transport missions until the end of Australia's involvement in Vietnam. Interesting to note, the Booneroo became the first ship to serve under the newly introduced Australian White Ensign. This was a response to the awkward situation that Australia was previously fighting under the White Ensign she shared with Britain, although the UK was not involved in the war. Together, the Booneroo and Jeparit transported nearly 200,000 deadweight tons of cargo to South Vietnam. Thank you for watching this video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you again next week for the second part about the Australian Navy's involvement in Vietnam. Cheers!